I happened to be at the right place at the right time with an open mind. And he said to me, could you not have a bin? And so that has been the most significant question of my life.
Hey folks, welcome to a new episode of the You Can't Eat Money podcast. This episode, we're joined by Douglas McMaster, creator of Silo, the world's first zero-waste restaurant, located right here in London, and home to one of the most tasty and thought-provoking meals I've ever had. I've wanted to have Douglas on the podcast for a while after reading his incredible book, Silo, the Zero-Waste Blueprint. His book actually reminds me a lot of Yvon Chouinard, the founder of Patagonia's book, Let My People Go Surfing. It's part instructional guide with details on the Silo formula, a seasonal eating guide, and even some recipes. But really, at its heart, it's a philosophy book. It covers how Silo came to be, how it operates today, and the vision Douglas has for the future of our food system. He is truly an innovator, and I think so much of this podcast is applicable to any listener in any industry who is looking to shake up a broken system with some new ideas and new ways of doing things. While we touch on a few of the key ideas in the book, we actually go a lot further and cover new items in Douglas's work, like the zero-waste cooking school he started. He also shares some tips on how you can become a more mindful eater and home cook, and details on the Invasive Species Dinner series at Silo, which features items like Japanese knotweed, gray squirrel, and the feisty American Signal Crayfish. A huge thanks to Douglas for taking time to chat. It was a real honor, and if any of you listening are in London and have never been to Silo, I urge you to make a reservation now. I recommend sitting at the bar to get a glimpse of the inner workings of one of the most inventive, creative restaurants on the planet. As always, if you enjoy the podcast, please leave a rating and review on your favorite podcast platform. It really helps more people find the podcast and hopefully grow our group of ecologically conscious eaters. Without further ado, here's the latest episode of the You Can't Eat Money podcast with Douglas McMaster, creator of Silo. Today on the You Can't Eat Money podcast, we have Douglas McMaster, creator of Silo, the world's first zero-waste restaurant, first in Brighton, now in London. Thanks for joining the podcast, Douglas.
Absolute pleasure to be here.
I've read your amazing book that's sort of a cookbook / storybook / blueprint for the future. And you talk a lot about your different inspirations that led to creating Silo. Mentioned Dan Barber, who we've had on the podcast before. You also mentioned St. John. What were some of those points of inspiration that led you to where you are today with Silo and becoming the world's first zero-waste restaurant?
Yeah, well, I would. There's definitely certain figures like Dan Barber. There's certain chefs that really have been a great inspiration to me. Rene Redzepi would be another name. Matt Orlando, and various other. James Lowe was a particularly good mentor to me, and I have had really good mentors and good guidance. But I certainly don't look into hospitality, I don't look around me for inspiration, or historically, unconsciously, I've not found the inspiration around me. I've found it from what's wrong, rather than what I thought was right. So it's less about a kind of geographical or an individual place of inspiration. It's more a resistance to what I don't think is good. So Silo is predicated on what I thought was wrong with the industry. And that goes, obviously, our sort of USP is zero waste. And that is, it's definitely the most salient thing to talk about because of its point of difference in the industry. But Silo is a manifestation of all the things that I thought were terrible. And that goes into, the work culture in the restaurant. How do people talk to each other? How do people appreciate each other? How do we nurture creativity and openness, kindness? And Silo is designed on those, a whole kind of network of beliefs, but it was born out of what was wrong. Yeah, but I have been very lucky to have some really amazing role models and mentors. And St. John was a restaurant that defined, it kind of broke away from what was happening in gastronomy in the 90s and did something so independent and unique, and it's such a pure expression of an idea, of a worldview, that I just found illuminating. And it was less about what they did, it's like how or where that came from. It was a kind of confidence in an expression, in an idea, in a vision, and it's that I fell in love with around St. John. Noma in Copenhagen, I fell in love with the fact that they looked around them in the industry and say, why are we just importing these like expensive ingredients around the world and just kind of putting it on a plate? Like, why are we not looking locally at, why is a wild leaf not as precious as truffle? I like that. That freedom of expression. I like the rebellious nature and anti-conforming, against certain things that need to improve within a space. So yeah, that's where I find inspiration.
In terms of inspiration outside of the food industry and hospitality industry specifically, I know you spent some time in Australia with a guy named Youst, who I think was on, if you've seen Netflix's Zac Efron show, they featured him in the Melbourne episode. Can you talk a little bit about that experience and kind of how his vision has informed your approach?
Yeah, absolutely. You definitely need to get Youst on the podcast. I was on a Zoom meeting with him 2 hours ago. I was early morning coffee. He was late Friday night beer in the local pub. So it's a colourful call as always with Youst. He's, I mean this in the best possible way, a cartoon character. He's just so unique, who he is and the way he acts and the way he behaves, like a cartoon character. Yeah, he's a remarkable individual that has a trait that is common amongst geniuses, and that trait is the childlike, opportunistic view of things that could be done. And sometimes it sounds derogatory to describe somebody as a child, but I mean it in the context of the awe, the wide-eyed understanding or belief that anything can happen. When you're a child, you've not been told that all of these things are not the way of the world, or like you can't do this or you can't do that. A child's like just trying things, and that's like the prerequisite to being creative. Openness. If you imagine somebody with blinkers like a horse, that blinkers represents all of the stories that we've been told and that we ascribe to and we believe in and see as reality, when it's not really reality, it's just stories. A big part of being creative is understanding that they're stories and not conforming to them. And Youst has that amazing childlike ability to see solutions, to see just ideas, and not be kind of buried under the fear that they're not appropriate or suitable, or he just does things and they're just so simple and brilliant, and other people don't think about them because there's too many filters. And so Youst was the guy that said, could you not have a bin? Which was the formative question that is I guess the nucleus of Silo. He, for context, was an artist that turned waste materials into things, into installations, into sculptures, into artworks, into floral displays, and eventually was commissioned by the Sydney Council in 2011 to make a whole building out of waste materials. And it was built to grow food and be a living, breathing kind of organism. And it was at that time, he was clearly thinking about waste on a very sophisticated and deeper level. And the building made from waste still kind of created waste within it. And so that was his train of thought. And I happened to be at the right place at the right time with an open mind. And he said to me, could you not have a bin? And so that has been the most significant question of my life, and has, it's forged the future of zero waste restaurants, and zero waste as a movement, as a philosophy. That's something that I've introduced heavily to this idea of not having a bin, is like what that represents as an idea, like as a sort of existential idea. Waste exists because of humans. No other species has waste. And this is something that I explore in the book heavily, and like where waste exists, unsustainability is. It's like a symptom of unsustainable systems. And so I've taken it into that sort of realm of philosophy, and Yoast was where that all came from.
Maybe let's unpack that core idea, because I've talked to a lot of people about Silo, especially people who hadn't heard about you before. When I tell them, it's the restaurant without a bin, it's zero waste, they're like, that can't be true. They've got to have a hidden bin somewhere. They've got to have some sort of system that breaks breaks their vision in some way or another. So there's like the existential idea you said about not having a bin, but then there's like the practical piece. So like, does Silo have a bin? Is there some other way that you deal with some of the things that maybe aren't completely like digestible within the system?
So I'm just going to paint the picture a little bit. It won't take me long. And it's how we literally don't have a bin. And I'll come on to the truth of that in a second. So the idea is simply, and this was Yoast's idea actually, he said, just get everything you need from nature. Go to a farm, go to a forest, go to, get the fish from a fisher human, and get everything from nature, directly from nature, in reusable vessels. And by that time that everything comes into the restaurant in these reusable vessels, there is no plastic or polystyrene or unnecessary packaging. And so all that will be left at the end of the meal is food waste. And food waste isn't waste. It's the potential for food for soil, i.e. compost. And so we'll have a compost machine and turn all of that food waste into compost. And then when the farmers come into the restaurant with the crates of vegetables, we can give them bags of compost to go back. So there's this kind of closed loop direct trade system, which is so simple, so beautiful. And that was Yoast. And that 95% of what would necessitate a bin is like immediately mitigated through that design, through direct trade. Now, that isn't very achievable or applicable to most restaurants, most food systems, for a lot of reasons, scale and the lack of regenerative farms, or the distance, lots of reasons why that's not being rolled out as we speak. But just to, again, return to the not having a bin at Silo, the last 5% is much more challenging. We do lots of really radical creative things to not waste that last 5%. Which would be things like, I don't know, where do we print the menus? How do we print the menus? Is it printed or is it projected, which is our innovation? We project the menu, so there's no paper waste, there's no ink from the printer. The light bulbs, how do we get a light bulb that's not wrapped in plastic? How do we label our food containers? All these little things, like they all necessitate a bin. It's not one solution, it's all different solutions. In a nutshell, that's how we don't have a bin. But then the truth to that is that there is so much human error in this system. I wish that there was the infrastructure around us to facilitate the vision. There isn't. And plastic is everywhere. Polystyrene is everywhere. These materials are everywhere. And there's a lot of people involved with our process and systems. And to cut a long story short, it's imperfect. We make mistakes every day. I'll give you some examples, but if we have a supplier and the supplier, like salt, we deal directly with a salt harvesting facility in Cornwall. And once upon a time, I asked them to deliver everything in paper. They said to me, sorry, Doug, salt is susceptible for water damage. And if we have a paper bag and there's rain, it damages the salt. And then you'll send it back and say, oh, it's sort of, damaged goods. He said, I'm not willing to take that risk. It's going to come in plastic. So I said to Phil, I'm going to write you a disclaimer, a legally binding disclaimer saying that if any water damage comes to that salt, I take full responsibility. So that's an example of this 5%, the last bit of individual circumstances. And so Phil's like, yeah, fine, great. And then boom, we've always received salt in paper and there's never been a problem with water damage. And so the truth is, Phil has staff that work for him. He doesn't package every bit of salt. And then somebody new comes into that work environment and sends a ton of salt in plastic, big, 20 kilo sacks or whatever. And then they send it, not knowing that our case is a unique case where they have this unique relationship or whatever. So that design is formulated, but mistakes happen. And so what do we do when a ton of salt has been delivered to our restaurant in like blue plastic 20 kilo sacks? It would be totally irresponsible to send it back to, complain. So yeah, we accept it, and that's okay. Like humans will all make mistakes, and we're not trying to say that this is perfect. That's not the point. The point is that we care and that we're trying and we're doing everything in our power to do the right thing. Now, what did we do with those blue plastic sacks? What do we do with all the other mistakes? Well, we hold on to them like squirrels, holding on to nuts, storing them and waiting for an idea to turn that into a thing, into something that we can like close a loop with it. We're always trying to tweak this system rather, is always morphing and changing with the years rolling on and the suppliers changing and behaviors changing and habits changing and rules changing and menus changing and people changing. And it's always imperfect. And we're constantly tuning in that orchestra. We hold on to those mistakes. And I've got this vision to do an artwork called Human Error. And I want to sculpt the letters, Human Error, and have it proudly pinned above the canal. Silo's on a canal, and pin each letter Human Error on the canal. But the letters are sculpted from the actual waste. That phrase, wear your shame like armor. That's a powerful phrase that's been very instrumental in my life. It's something I'm not good at. I tend to hide it, or would once upon a time. And then if I'm not good at something, I've changed. I've been like, right, no, that doesn't work for me, internalizing it and hiding it. Be honest, be vulnerable, show the world that it's okay to be vulnerable. And, there's something honorable and just something really nice about, showing that we're not perfect. We are subject to human error. This is an imperfect scenario, the industrial food industry. It's, but that's okay. And just to be very open about where we haven't got everything figured out, to draw attention to the part of the system which isn't complete.
When I went to the restaurant, the staff is incredibly well informed, and they help point out these things. And they're like, this pendant light was made from, I think, seaweed, and this bread plate was made from recycled. So that point about, sort of wearing your shame, which is really like a human shame as armor, like part of it's transparency, but part of it is also like this expression of creativity with what we can do with it, which seems to be like a big red thread through everything at Silo.
Yes, absolutely. Just think that kind of transparent, open, vulnerable dialogue, people are going to feel more open themselves. Silo is such a radical kind of series of ideas and kind of views. And if we present ourselves as like heroic and, we've got everything figured out and we're too cool for school, people are going to be closed. Whereas if we're honest, transparent, and vulnerable, people are going to be open. And that's the point. We're trying to create a system and demonstrate a worldview that we think is a healthy behavior within a system, i.e. the food industry, for the future. And like we want people to appreciate it and to think, well, I'm not going to try and be like Silo, but there is a couple of good ideas here which we could incorporate into our own model, and to influence subtly in various different ways, the design world. How has zero waste affected the design world? How has zero waste affected the community of chefs within the London food scene? all the staff that have moved through the business, how do they go on and influence the industry? The dialogue about is the most sustainable or ethical diet inclusive of animals or not? Is sustainability vegan or not? And it's just this openness and this dialogue, which I think done in this way, in this sort of, non-dogmatic, more fallible form of communication, presenting a vast series of pieces of information. Yeah, I think that people are more willing to adopt them if we're open and vulnerable.
And I think part of that, which you do a great job in sort of the blueprint explaining all those things that you just touched on, and we'll kind of circle back to some of those things. But part of that is this idea of direct trade that you've mentioned, which essentially you point out that the middleman kind of is this like weird layer in the system that creates a lot of obfuscation, makes it really hard for people to see what they're getting, but also chefs and restaurants. So you've designed Silo to be like a pre-industrial food system, I think is the term you use. What does that mean for someone who maybe hasn't read the book?
I'm glad you brought that up, because we mentioned at the beginning that how we achieve this isn't necessarily accessible to most of the restaurants or food services. I was saying that we get everything from farmers, and how is that achievable for the home cook? Somebody at home that hears me talking about direct trade, they're like, well, yeah, that's good for you, but I can't get milk in a pail from the local dairy farm because I only go through, 500 ml of milk every single week, so it's not accessible. A pre-industrial food system, it's motivated by the observation that industrialization of food systems is why waste exists. Humans have created that system, so humans are the reason waste exists. But within industrialism, there is waste. That is where waste is in great numbers. So the organization of that system, the packaging that is necessary because of that system, i.e., food's been passed through many different hands and many different places, that for food safety, there needs to be this kind of regulation of plastic and all kinds of unnecessary packaging that is single use because it's linear, i.e. from farm to landfill. It's one way, it doesn't go back. And so waste exists because of that industrialization. What we're doing is saying that 100 years ago, those systems didn't exist and that everything was direct trade. And if we can appreciate how the food supply chains and the food system was back before industrialization, that's how we can not have waste. Predominantly, generally speaking, the bulk of it. People can still waste food in their homes in a pre-industrial food system. So this is very general. Basically, we circumvent an industrial supply chain to not have a bin. Now, is that accessible to the wider world? No. So how does the wider world adopt a zero waste food system in the future? It's a case of we have done what we've done because there hasn't been an infrastructure with all of the things we're talking about, all of the values, the principles or whatever. Now, the more people are aware, through mediums like this podcast, that there is an alternative zero waste future, are aware of the circumstances or the implications of plastic pollution, carbon emissions affecting the ozone layer and affecting, the temperature of the planet, and the soil degradation from industrial farming and the lack of biodiversity and all these examples of why industrial food systems are damaging the planet. So the more people are aware of that and aware that there are solutions, like Silo is one, there are many, and there are many things to take and to adapt from, say, Silo. By being aware of that, people can come online to this future. They can say no to plastic. They can go into a supermarket, say, no, I'm not going to buy all these apples in a plastic bag. I'm going to just pick up the loose ones instead. Just simple little tiny decisions like that, times millions is going to make a huge impact. And the culture changes slowly and will, I'm sure, continue to change in a positive direction. And the more people come online to that in lots of different pockets around the world and different, systems, they reject the industrial food systems, or the negative parts of the industrial food systems, like plastic and pollution and, loads of things. And then the people within those systems get their shit together, change their systems to hear how people want the future to be, to listen and adapt. And that, what I'm trying to say is, these industrial food systems that are the problem could actually change, can adapt, So like you can see it already, but how we're moving away from single-use plastics to bioplastics, that's a relatively small step into where we need to be, but it's already happening.
And on the podcast, from Dan Barber to the folks at the Berry Center, like one reoccurring theme has been know your farmer, which really speaks to that idea of direct trade. What I think is interesting that you do, which I think helps people, at least mentally, is the zero waste cooking school. What was sort of the idea behind that? How have people reacted? Is that part of this mission to kind of take it from a silo to something people can use and utilize in their day-to-day, in their at-home kitchen?
Yeah, the zero waste cooking school is exactly that. It is, how do we make the largest number of people aware of the potential solutions to waste and to sustainability? It's broadcasting the idea as widely as possible. It's still, the subject of zero waste is still quite, in 100 years, they might look back and, 2023 was still hadn't started yet. Mass populations, kind of collective awareness of what zero waste is, what it means, why it's important, we're still in the absolute infancy of that progress. The zero waste cooking schools to try and accelerate that progress to that place where people understand it more and more and more and feel welcome into that kind of way of thinking, that community, and trying to make it accessible. In a nutshell, Silo's not that accessible. It's an East London restaurant and it's quite intimidating to a lot of people. Not everyone cares about this, and it's not, for me to say they should care at all. Like, I don't know, if you hear something about a restaurant and it's like, oh, it's like zero waste and all this stuff, and if that's new news to you, it's like, oh, doesn't sound delicious. I want to go to a restaurant to have a good time, and all of a sudden there's all this talk about environmentalism, and that's not what I think about. It's intimidating. So the zero waste cooking school is to make it more palatable, to gently kind of work in a less absolute way. Silo is really absolute. It's fanatical, and that sort of fanaticism is unpalatable to a large population. And so, we're trying to make it more palatable, less absolute. We'll do recipes that are by no means as extreme measures as Silo. Not everything's direct trade. Not everything is perfect. We'll get everything from the farmer's market, and we'll get the dry goods from a bulk store. But, occasionally there'll be products or recipes that are just what people want to eat. And there'll be just little subtle nods to doing it in a better way, in a better version. And so it's, more subtle, delicate, gentle, a more accessible approach to the subject. And that's the idea. Still very early days in the project. I'm a chef, started a restaurant when I was 26, didn't know what I was doing, and just kind of made it up as I was going along. And now we're at a very sort of established place where it really does make sense. Economically, it does make sense. Kind of commercially, it does make sense in a lot of different ways. It was just this kind of restaurant, this idea, this burning vision in my head that I had to get out as a really young, underexperienced chef. And this project's not too dissimilar in that, I'm now a 35, 30, I don't know, I'm 36, 36, I think I am. Chef that has a restaurant, knows nothing about production, nothing about, I know a bit about social media, but I need to run this project like I would run, it's like Silo. How do I need to run it quite well. Can't exist just by good ideas. And so, yeah, we're in that sort of those early days of trying to figure it all out, and it's growing quickly, but still has a long way to grow. It's still an infant learning how to walk.
And I want to go back to something you talked about at the beginning. So part of the idea of Silo is getting people to open up a little bit when they approach this, how they eat, how they think about eating. You talked about how in the book you do have a really nice articulation of what you think is ethical meat and what is not ethical meat. And I think one of the most, I don't know, creative, but also mind-opening practices that you have is the invasive species dinner. Can you talk about that idea around what is ethical meat and how you apply it through the invasive species dinner?
So there's a number of, I guess, plateaus to what could be discussed as ethical meat. The invasive debate or plateau is the most obvious, the most kind of, yeah, this really does make sense to eat meat. The other plateaus would be like, if an animal is part of a regenerative system, and that animal breeds and overpopulates, is it then ethical to cull the animal to kind of restore order to that environment? Is that ethical? That's one sort of series of, or that's one way of considering ethical meat. And then invasive species, a species that exists in our environment that is damaging the environment. Is it then ethical to cull that animal to restore? It's always about balance. Sustainability is always just about balancing a system. I kind of repeat myself in different guises, but whether it's on a farm or in the wild, essentially, we kind of play God. We're choosing to take a life to restore order to the environment. Now, one of the arguments that I've come to the point of many times with predominantly vegans is they'll say, yeah, but they're invasive because of us. There'll be an overpopulation of deer, venison, in Britain and many other countries because we've killed the wolves. And the wolves were their predator, and the wolves, restored order in the amount of venison that existed within in a habitat. And we've killed the wolves, so that's our fault that they are invasive, and that is the case 100% of the time, or maybe 98% of the time, or something like that. So we're the problem, and the very valid argument from a vegan's point of view is like we should stop trying to control nature. We should stop having the privilege to kill other species. And that is a really very solid point of view. And I really do respect that. I think the damage is going to outweigh the sort of nobility of that point of view. I do think we should cull the venison to create the best chances of order within an environment. Something happens called a trophic cascade. So the venison overpopulate in an environment. They graze the bracken and the different areas of a woodland in a way which means that there's no habitat for birds to live. And when the birds don't live, the insects overpopulate. And then when that happens, there's all these different like domino effects within an ecosystem. And nature has had millions of years designing this system, and that humans have basically ruined it. But anyway, the invasive species dinner is just this thought process manifested into a dinner. And some of the ingredients include the venison, as we've mentioned, squirrels, gray squirrels, non-native squirrels that have been introduced and have overpopulated and pretty much wiped out the native red squirrel. And they eat trees and destroy forests, woodlands and forests. And so, squirrels on the menu. In the plant world, we've got Japanese knotweed, which is like bamboo that grows through concrete, and it's so destructive. Anywhere it grows, all the other nature around it dies. It's not meant for this environment. Brought over in the early 19th century from Japan as an ornamental plant, and just went bananas. If you have it on your property, you may not be able to sell that property because it's that destructive. So yeah, Japanese knotweed. We made 2,000 liters of Japanese knotweed sour beer. That was fun. What else have we got? We've got seaweed called sargassum, also known as Japanese wireweed, another Japanese seaweed that had been brought over, and it's like wire. And when little boats with a little motor try and boat around where there's Japanese wireweed, it tangles up and destroys the boats. So it's destructive to anyone with a motorboat. American Signal Crayfish. So American big muscular crayfish destroys a native British crayfish, and they're pretty much wiped out the British crayfish. And they're vicious beasts. These crayfish, they eat their own babies, and they're horrible. But they're big, juicy little lobsters that are delicious. And so we did a menu where we're like cooking a whole menu of those different species. We had squirrel koftas, we had crayfish bisques, we had Japanese knotweed sour beer, and Japanese knotweed umeboshi, and Japanese knotweed ripple ice cream, and sargassum in the butter, and venison on the main course. Various different creative ways of making those invasive species delicious. Because, regarding that balance of sustainability, taking those out of the food system is creating more harmony within those environments.
Yeah, it's incredible. I remember seeing the gray squirrel on the list and was like, ooh, it was one of those mind-opening moments where I was like, I see some of those on my balcony. It definitely changed my perspective on things. So to sort of end on, I think it would be good, because you clearly are probably one of the most thoughtful people around food that I've come in contact with. For someone like me, who's not a chef, who tries his best to go to the farmer's market and, do what I can to get responsible food. But, sometimes I have to go to Tesco, or I have to go to a regular restaurant that I'm not familiar with their sourcing practices. Like, what do you recommend to the average eater in terms of being more thoughtful about their food selections?
Firstly, on a psychological level, don't feel overwhelmed by this subject, because as soon as you feel overwhelmed, you're going to tap out. You're going to be like, this is too much. I feel overwhelmed. But there can be a lot of anxiety around the future and the subject in various different ways. And just to do the best you can within the limit of your own sustainability. So I have this elastic band metaphor in my head of like, silo can push the elastic band, and the elastic band represents like pushing the sustainability ideas and environmental sustainability and the staff welfare sustainability and the economical sustainability, and we're improving, we're doing the best we can without that elastic band breaking. And so the tension or the breadth of that is different for everyone. And if you're a single mother of 3 children, and you want to do the best you can and feed them healthy, nutritious food and not damage the planet, you can only work within the capacity you can. We can be aware of it. We can do the best we can within that reach, but not to try any harder. Don't try and push beyond that. Don't push beyond your own sustainability. So that's just something to be mindful of. We're all in different positions, everyone in the world. Try the best we can within those limitations. Some people are lucky and live near a farmer's market, and if that's the case, that is direct trade. That's beautiful. And there's loads of zero waste solutions. You go there with, I go every week with a bottle like this and just fill up milk. I'm very lucky to live next to one. Not so lucky with the bulk stores, which is the second tip. Bulk stores used to be very popular. Like 50 years ago, you'd go in and just fill produce into your own containers and take them home. And they're now having a bit of a renaissance in popularity and coming into the big sort of progressive cities like London. There's none near where I live. But yeah, if you are lucky enough to have one of those near your house, that's a great thing to do. And it's really satisfying as well when you've just got loads of Kilner jars full of whole ingredients. It really does change. It becomes quite a beautiful little food system in your own home. I think supporting good people doing things right. So we have a really good veg box company called Riverford, and Riverford Organics are farming organically and regeneratively, and they're thinking about zero waste, and the boxes are really affordable. They're like £15, and it's a big box of vegetables. And if you go to Tesco's and buy the same vegetables, I guarantee it's going to be 18, 19, £20. It's going to be more. And it's all going to be in plastic. It's all going to be industrially farmed. And this just comes to your house automatically every week and it's done. There are really thoughtful solutions. There are really simple, easy, affordable solutions to living better in this way. If you are beholden to going to the supermarket every week, be aware that the center of the supermarket is where all of the really industrial processed foods live. The outsides of supermarkets, especially the bigger ones, are where you find the fish stall or the bakery and some bigger ones, the butcher, and that's loose. And you can go there, with all of your like refillable containers, and from a supermarket, you can be dodging unnecessary waste. The connection that we have to food, even if it's that small interaction, talking to a butcher about, what's good, what's this cut, what's this, what can I do with oxtail? Those moments change our relationship to food. We have a greater level of affection and kind of connection to it. And so we're less likely to waste it. That's a big reason why waste exists in the world, is because we're so detached from nature, from food. And when nature becomes a commodity, i.e. food that you just buy to fuel yourself, it becomes expendable. It's like, well, this has some value. I just spent £1.50 on a sandwich. It's value, but it's a monetary value. And you're like, well, I'm full now, so I'm just going to throw it. And it was cheap enough to throw away. Fine. And it's a commodity. There's not a connection to the nature. Everything's from nature, and we don't have any connection to that, so it becomes expendable. And so reconnecting, whether it's at the farmer's market or even like in a supermarket, talking to your butcher about what oxtail is, that's reconnecting with the kind of the natural world and with our food systems, and our responsibility changes, and our love of it changes.
Fantastic tips. I actually think I heard a knock on my door, which is my Riverford box for this week. I definitely recommend that tip. I think they're a great company for sure. So thank you so much, Douglas, for taking the time to chat today. I can't wait to get this episode out to the listeners.
Pleasure.